Chapter 35. But that's not the end of the story. After Nikolai left her home, a new prisoner came to camp who knew nothing of the man and ox who ran all day on Fridays so they could rest on Saturdays. The new man, Gennady, was also given the job of hauling water from the spring every day, and he quickly learned to plod along behind the ox cart. Like Nikolai, he knew that the job was the one most hated by all the men in the camp. No one else wanted to do all that walking. However, he also discovered that Maxim was stubborn and would refuse to do anything that was not part of his regular regiment. The old ox refused to be hurried. He refused to be intimidated. He refused to continue working after dark. Not surprisingly, Gennady soon came to admit he wasn't the one in charge while on their trips to the spring. Maxim obviously was. They were up at the crack of dawn every day, plodding laboriously back and forth to the spring, but always on Maxim's own terms. But on that first Friday morning, Gennady was in for the surprise of his life. The old ox fairly ran his legs off all day, and Gennady was so shocked he didn't know what to think. No one had bothered beforehand to tell him about Maxim's strange habits or his famous track record. Maybe it was because they wanted to see the look on Gennady's face when he finally witnessed it for himself. Maybe they were looking forward to hearing the new driver rant on and on about how crazy the old ox was. Maybe it was just that the whole thing had been going on for so long now that they never thought about it as a strange and unusual event anymore. But on that first Friday, as Maxim came running back into the camp, Gennady came huffing and puffing along behind him. The poor prisoner looked as though he had been running a race. When he finally came to a stop, he bent over with his hands on his knees, wheezing and desperately trying to catch his breath. Perspiration dripped from his face, and his clothes were completely soaked with sweat. But if he thought he was going to get a rest, he was in for a second surprise. Maxim never really gave Gennady time to get his breath back to normal. No sooner were the water barrels unloaded from the cart than the old ox took off again in a cloud of dust. And that was the last anyone saw of them until over an hour later when they came racing back down the road into camp again. This time Gennady was even further behind. Who would have thought that an ox pulling a cart full of water barrels would outdo a man running on foot? Of course, Maxim was used to this. He had been doing it for more than 8 years now. The two of them went at it all morning. On the ride out to the spring, Gennady jumped on the cart for a rest. However, when the cart had two full barrels on it, he had to run on foot all the way back. Each time they came racing back into camp, Gennady would take a few moments to rest, but he knew he dared not wait too long for fear that the ox would take off for the spring again with the full water barrels still on the cart. By late afternoon, Gennady looked as though he had been running a marathon, and it appeared he would drop from exhaustion any moment. He might never have made it through the afternoon had Pitcha not come to his aid the last few trips to help him unload the full water barrels from the cart. "What's wrong with that animal?" Gennady would shout every time he came stumbling into camp. "He's going to kill me!" Of course, everyone just laughed because they knew the rest of the story and were having their fun at Gennady's expense. But by the end of the day, Gennady could take it no longer. As the sun neared its resting place below the horizon, an old Maxim had pulled the bumping cart into camp for the last time, Gennady slumped to the ground, his back against the wheel of the ox cart. I give up, he panted and closed his eyes as Petya and several other men gathered around. This ox is possessed, he rasped, putting his hands on his head. There is no other explanation. Yes, there is. A voice sounded nearby, and Gennady turned to see the warden standing behind them. The warden paused for effect. You see, that preacher from Kiev has been training old Maxim for years. Nikolai Panchuk refused to work on the seventh day of every week, and he's spoiled the ox with that busyness of his, ruined him, and he'll never be the same. The warden looked around the circle of men and then directly at Gennady. There's no doubt about it in my mind. That preacher made a Sabbath keeper of the ox. And truly he had. Old Maxim had turned into a seventh-day ox. But it hadn't really been any of Nikolai's doing. The preacher had run side by side with Maxim all of those years to bring enough water to last through the Sabbath. And it had always taken a marathon Friday to finish the job each week. The credit for such a phenomenon was all God's, of course, and everyone who wanted to know the truth had been told so by Nikolai. Even after Nikolai had left the prison camp and returned home to his family, the influence of his holy life lived on through the testimony of an ox. Old Maxim continued to be true to his duties, ready to be used by his Creator as a witness for the Sabbath. Nikolai Panchuk was gone, but when there was no one left to share the gospel story, there was still Maxim, the seventh-day ox.